They called her a useless bride, until her secret skill saved the dying cattle herd. The first steer went down on a Tuesday, 2 hours before first light. I heard it from the bunkhouse, not the animal, but the silence after. There's a sound cattle make when one of their own drops, a low collective breath that's not quite a moan, not quite nothing, and I'd been ranching long enough that I woke out of a dead sleep to it. I pulled my boots on without lighting the lamp and went out. Hector Vines was already standing over the steer with a lantern. The animal was on its side, legs working slow, eyes gone milky at the edges. I knelt and put my hand on its flank and felt the heat through the hide. That wrong, wet heat that's not fever exactly, but something underneath fever, something working in the blood. "Second one this week," Hector said. I didn't answer him. I already knew. We'd lost 43 head over the previous 3 weeks on the Garza spread, which was the ranch I'd been running as foreman for 11 years. And nobody, not me, not Hector, not the 2 younger hands, not Doc Priestley who came out from Laredo at 75 cents a mile, could tell old Augusto Garza what was killing them. Priestley had said blackleg, then changed his mind to anthrax, then said he'd never seen anthrax present quite like this and charged us full price anyway. Garza had paid it and stood watching me from under the brim of his hat with eyes that didn't say anything good. I was 58 years old that spring. I'd given 11 years to that ranch, before that 12 to the Kuehler operation up near Eagle Pass, and before that 7 years punching cattle for whoever would have me after I came back from the war with one good ear and a limp that let up in warm weather. I knew cattle the way some men know scripture, which is to say I knew them well, and they still had the capacity to surprise me into feeling stupid. The steer died at sunrise. I sent Hector for the wagon. That same morning, before I'd had a chance to wash the blood off my hands, Augusto Garza came down from the house and told me his son's new wife had arrived on the overnight stage from San Antonio. I said that was fine. He looked at me for a moment with those flat eyes. "Raphael is in Monterey until the end of the month. I need you to bring her in from Murrabel's station. Get cleaned up first." That was it. I rode the 12 miles to Murrabel's, still thinking about the steer. Her name was Celia Fuentes, from a family outside Saltillo that I later learned had been in the cattle business for 4 generations before drought and bad debt had ended it when she was 16. She was 26 when I met her, small and dark-haired, and she was standing outside Murrabel's with one trunk and a leather bag that she carried herself before I could get to it. She thanked me when I loaded the trunk. She didn't make conversation on the way back, which I respected. She looked at the range the whole ride with a kind of attention that I took at the time for nervousness. She wasn't nervous, I know that now. She was reading the land. The ranch hand's opinion of her was settled before she'd been on the property 3 days. Hector said she seemed delicate. Young Tomás said she didn't know enough to stay out of the kitchen, by which he meant she'd ask the cook questions about what the hands were eating. Marta, the housekeeper, reported to Garza that the new señora was very polite but kept wandering near the corrals, which wasn't appropriate. Garza told me to keep her occupied with the house until Raphael returned. I said I'd pass that along. I did not pass that along because she wasn't mine to manage and I had other problems. We lost 2 more animals the following week, a heifer and a young bull we'd been expecting great things from. Priestley came back, charged us again, and this time said he thought it was a tick-borne illness and recommended we burn the south pasture to drive the ticks out. I'd never heard of burning pasture for ticks and told him so. He did not appreciate my opinion on the matter. That night I was in the linta beside the barn where I kept my tools and my records, going over what I knew, which wasn't enough. I had a map of the south pasture on the table, and I was marking where each animal had gone down, looking for a pattern and not finding one that made sense. I heard the door. She was carrying a lamp and she dressed for outside, boots, a wool jacket, her hair pinned back. She looked at the map on my table without saying anything for a moment. "May I?" she said and gestured at it. I stepped back. She studied it. She had her finger moving along the creek line without touching the paper, just tracing above it. She asked me where the watering holes were in the south pasture, and I pointed them out. She asked which ones the sick animals had been using, and I told her the two I was fairly certain of. She nodded in a way that wasn't satisfaction exactly. It was more like confirmation of something she'd already suspected. "There's a plant," she said. "Grows near standing or slow water in this part of Texas. Looks like wild onion, but it isn't. The cattle eat it and don't die right away. It takes 2-3 weeks. By the time they show signs, you can't trace it back. My grandfather called it yerba mala." She looked at me. "Have you seen it? Blue-green. Grows in clumps, usually half in the mud." I thought about it. I'd seen something like that, but I'd been looking for ticks. "If that's what it is," she said, "you need to fence them away from those 2 watering points immediately and bring them to the north well. Then there's a treatment, copper sulfate solution, the right dose by weight, that will help the ones who have had it recent if you catch them early enough. The ones already showing the milky eyes are probably too far gone, but the others you can save." She said it the way you state a fact you've known for a long time and are tired of keeping to yourself. I looked at her. I said, "Where did you learn that?" "My father's ranch," she said. "We lost 60 head to yerba mala when I was 12. My grandfather identified it. I watched him treat the survivors." She paused. "I tried to tell Senor Garza 2 days ago. He thanked me and suggested I speak to Dr. Priestley. I said a word about Dr. Priestley that I won't repeat here. Then I put on my coat, and we went out to the south pasture in the dark with her lamp." She knew what she was looking at. I'll say that plainly because it needs saying. We found the plant inside of 20 minutes, 2 heavy clumps of it growing right at the waterline of the smaller hole, blue-green and thick-stemmed, and she crouched down and showed me the cross-section of the stem where the sap ran the wrong color. I'd walked past it a dozen times. I'd walked past it specifically looking for what was killing my cattle, and I'd walked past it. We fenced both watering points the following morning before breakfast. I rode into Laredo myself for the copper sulfate. Hector and Tomás moved the herd to the north pasture without being told why, because I told them to, and they knew better than to ask when my voice had that particular tone. We lost 3 more animals over the next 8 days, the ones already too far gone, the ones with the milky eyes that I'd known weren't going to make it. Every other animal that showed early symptoms we treated. The losses stopped. In 3 weeks the herd was stable. Augusto Garza walked the south pasture with me when it was over. He didn't say much. He was a man who expressed satisfaction by the absence of criticism, and when we walked back to the gate he said only, "I suppose Raphael's wife knows cattle." I said she does. He said good. That was all he said, and for Garza it was a great deal. What I want to tell you about, though, what I've been working up to, if I'm being honest, is not the cattle. The cattle is just what was happening when the real thing was happening, which is that I was paying attention to a woman in a way I hadn't paid attention to a woman in a long time, and it made me uneasy, and I didn't fully know why. I'll tell you why now, because I've had 15 years to understand it. I'd been alone since my wife Dora died in '81. 8 years alone, which isn't the longest stretch a man can run, but it's long enough that you start to think of yourself as finished in that particular department. Not bitter about it, not pining, just settled into the shape of a man who doesn't have that anymore. I did my work. I ran a good operation. I was respected on the Garza spread, which is not nothing. Garza was not a man who respected people out of politeness. I had what I needed. Or I'd convinced myself I did, which is a different thing, and for several years I'd managed not to notice the difference. Then this woman arrived and started reading the land the way I read it, and asking the right questions and knowing things, and I found I didn't know what to do with that. Let me tell you what I mean. One afternoon, it was about a week after the herd stabilized, and I was checking the fence line at the north pasture. I heard hooves and looked up, and she was coming along the ridge on Garza's gray mare, which surprised me because I didn't know she rode. She pulled up when she saw me, and we stood there for a moment in that way you do when you've unexpectedly ended up in the same place. I said something about the fence, I don't remember what. She looked out over the pasture. The herd was scattered across it, 200 and some head, grazing calm in the late afternoon light, and you could look at them and know they were right, the way you can look at cattle that are right and feel it in your chest. She said, you kept good records. The map you had, the positions marked, the dates. That's why we found it as fast as we did. I said the records were just part of the job. She looked at me then the way she'd looked at that map, which is to say with her full attention, and she said, no, most men wouldn't have had them that complete. You knew there was a pattern before you could see it. That's not ordinary. I didn't answer that. I looked at the herd. She rode on after a moment, and I stood there by the fence post with the wire stretcher in my hand and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, which was that a person who knew something about the work had looked at how I did my part of it and had seen it clearly. Not praised it, seen it. There's a difference. Raphael returned from Monterey in early May. He was 30 years old and had his father's flat eyes and not much else in common with him. He'd gone to Mexico City for school and come back with opinions about ranching that he delivered loudly to anyone who stood still long enough. He thanked me for saving the herd in the way a man thanks a hired hand, which is what I was, and I received it in the way a hired hand receives thanks, which is with a nod and nothing on my face. I heard from Marta that he'd told Celia she should have stayed out of ranch business, that the cattle were not her concern, that her job was the house. I heard this because Marta could not keep information to herself for longer than it took her to find someone to give it to, and she gave it to me because she knew I'd been involved. I did nothing with this information. It wasn't my marriage and it wasn't my ranch. But I started to see things I hadn't let myself see before that. I saw that Celia sat at dinner with her hands in her lap and said very little, and received Raphael's pronouncements on various subjects with an expression I recognized. It was the expression of someone managing themselves. I'd worn it myself in certain situations, with men who had authority over me and were wrong about something important, and I knew what it cost. I saw that when she had the chance to go outside, she went outside. She developed a habit of riding in the late afternoons, usually alone, usually north toward the better pasture. Once I passed her returning as I was heading out to check the water troughs, and she looked different out there, looser somehow, the management gone from her face. I saw that she was not useless. She was perhaps the least useless person on the property, including me, and nobody official seemed to know it. In June, Raphael decided to expand the south pasture. He wanted to push the fence line out and bring in another 100 head. I told him the grass wouldn't support it. The south had thin soil past a certain point, and we'd overgraze it inside 2 seasons. He told me he'd been managing property since before I could tell him what to do with it, which was a lie, but I let it sit. I went home that night to the foreman's house, which was a 2-room adobe I'd lived in for 11 years, and I sat on the step and looked at the dark and felt the particular weight of knowing you're right and having no ground to stand on. I'd been in that position before. Usually it passed. Usually I just did my work and let the outcome teach the lesson. But I was 58 years old, and I'd been right too many times, and had too many outcomes prove it, and watched too many men learn the lesson on the backs of good land and good animals that didn't deserve to be the schooling. I was still sitting there when I heard footsteps on the gravel. She came around the side of the house and stopped when she saw me. It was full dark by then, and she had no lamp. She said she'd been walking and seen my light. I said she should probably not be walking alone this late. She sat down on the other side of the step without being invited and without asking permission, which I respected. After a while she said, "He's going to expand the south pasture." I said I knew. She said, "The soil line, you told him where it changes. Did he look at your records?" I said no. She was quiet. Then, my father didn't listen either. Not to his foreman, not to my grandfather, not to anyone who knew more than he did about a thing he decided he already knew. That's part of how we lost everything. She paused. I don't mean that as comfort. I'm just telling you. I looked at her. In the dark she was just a shape in the pale oval of her face. I said, "Why are you telling me?" She said, "Because you know what you're talking about and no one here is treating you like you do, and that seems wrong." I didn't answer for a long time. Then I said, "He's your husband." She said, "Yes." That was all she said, and we sat there for a while in the dark, not close enough to touch. And she went back to the house before long, and I went inside and lay on my bunk and stared at the ceiling. I need you to understand something about that moment. I'm not telling this because anything improper happened, because nothing did, and I'm not telling it to make myself sound like more than I was. I'm telling it because it was the first time in 8 years that I sat next to a person who looked at me straight and said plainly that I was worth listening to. And the reason it hit me that hard was that I hadn't known how much I'd needed to hear it until I heard it. A man can go a long time not knowing what he's missing. That's not a complaint, it's just true. The South Pasture expansion went forward in July. I oversaw it because it was my job. Raphael brought in the extra 100 head in August, and by October the grass was thinning faster than it should have. I wrote it down. I kept my records the way I always kept them, exact, without opinion, just the numbers and the dates. Raphael left for Monterey again in September. He spent a good part of every year there, and the running of the place fell to me in his absence, as it always had, as it had long before he'd come back from his schooling with his opinions. Things on the ranch were different in those stretches, quieter, more honest. The hands worked better, I worked better, and Celia was, I don't have an elegant way to say this, herself. She came out to the corrals. She talked to Hector about the sick animals with a directness Hector had trouble handling at first, and then decided he didn't mind. She rode out to the south pasture and stood on the soil line and looked at the grass, and her face said what she was thinking. One morning I found her at the fence on the south edge, just standing there, and I rode over. She said without turning, "How long?" I said, "Spring, maybe. One more summer at this rate." She said, "Can it be recovered?" I said, "If someone lets it rest." She said, "I'll talk to Senor Garza." I said, "He doesn't generally." She said, "I'll talk to him." She talked to him. I don't know what she said. Augusto Garza was not a man who was talked into things, but he had a quality I'd long respected, which was that he would listen to a practical argument if you made it practically and didn't insult him while you were making it. 2 weeks later he told me to pull the extra 100 head back to the north pasture and let the south rest. He said it was his own decision, which was fine. I didn't need the credit. I needed the pasture. I told Celia what he'd decided and she just nodded. I said, "You made the argument well." She said, "I learned from watching you make the same argument and get nowhere. I just didn't frame it around what you know, I framed it around what he stands to lose. Different thing." I looked at her and she looked at me and I thought, there it is again. That thing she does where she looks right at me and says what she sees without dressing it up. I said, "That's better strategy than mine." She said, "You're better with the land, I'm better with Garza." A short pause. It would be useful if someone could be both. I understood what she was saying. I understood what she was not saying. Neither of us said anything else for a moment, and then I had to see about the water troughs. November came on cold that year, an early cold that came down off the plains like something personal. The Garza Ranch sat exposed on the eastern side of a long, shallow ridge, and in November it felt every bit of that exposure. The windmill froze twice. The water troughs had to be broken twice daily. I was out before first light every morning and not in until after full dark, and I was 58 years old and I felt it in my hip and my bad ear, and in a dozen places I hadn't felt 58 years in during the summer. Raphael was still in Monterey. There'd been some word about business complications. Garza had sent a writer twice and gotten letters back that explained nothing useful. It was during the second freeze that the heifer complications started. We had 6 pregnant heifers in the near corral, early calvers, most of them, and the cold came on before 3 of them were ready to go. I'd been through difficult births in winter before, but not 3 in close succession with the ground frozen, and the help I had not being the most experienced with that kind of work. Hector was good, but he'd only assisted. Tomás had assisted twice. The first one went sideways near midnight on the 3rd of November. The heifer had been laboring for 4 hours and the calf was positioned wrong. I could tell by the way she was going about it, the stops and starts, the wrong kind of distress. And I was in there with my coat off and my sleeves rolled, and it was cold enough that my breath showed and the lantern threw bad light, and I was doing what I could. Celia came into the barn at midnight. She'd been awake, I don't know how she knew. She said afterward she'd heard the heifer from the house, which is possible, the sound carries, and she came in dressed for work, hair down, sleeves already rolled, and she looked at what I was dealing with and said, "I can reach farther than you. Let me." I looked at her. She said, "My arms are narrower. I've done this. Let me." I stepped back. She knew what she was doing. I watched her and I could see that she knew exactly what she was doing, patient and unhurried in a way that's very hard to be in that situation, feeling for what she needed to find, talking to the animal in a low voice in a way that actually seemed to settle it. It took close to an hour. The calf came out at close to 2 in the morning and lay there in the straw and then got its legs under it, which is always the thing that catches me no matter how many times I've seen it. Celia sat back on her heels and let out a long breath. I handed her the rag I had. She wiped her hands and looked at the calf, and then she looked up at me and she smiled. Not a pleased with herself smile, just a real one, tired and real. I said, "Where did you learn that?" She said, "Same place I learned everything. My grandfather. He said difficult births and dying cattle were the same problem, patience and no panic." I said, "Your grandfather sounds like a man worth knowing." She said, he would have liked you." I didn't know what to do with that, so I checked on the calf. We lost the heifer, she'd been through too much, but the calf was healthy and we raised it on bottle, and it grew into a solid animal. The other 2 difficult births in November I handled with Celia there, and both came through clean. Hector started asking her questions about it after the second one, with his hat in his hands and a look of careful respect that I found quietly satisfying. Raphael came back in December. He came back different. Whatever had happened in Monterey, I never learned all of it, and it wasn't my business, had taken something out of him. He was quieter. He deferred to his father more than he had before. He looked at the ranch with a different set of eyes, or maybe just paid attention to what his old eyes were seeing for the first time. He asked me to walk the south pasture with him the week after he returned. We walked it. The grass was coming back slowly, but you could see it. The soil wasn't being worked to death anymore. I showed him my records and he actually read them this time without comment, and when he was done, he rolled them up and handed them back. He said, "Celia tells me you're the best foreman in this part of Texas." I said, "She's being generous." He said, "She's rarely generous. She's usually accurate." He paused. "She also tells me she saved the herd, but that you found the plant first." I said, "That's not how it happened." He said, "I know how it happened. She told me." He looked out at the pasture. "I owe you an apology for how I spoke to you when I returned in May." A man apologizing to his hired hand is a different thing than a man apologizing to an equal, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but it was a real apology and I accepted it. He walked back to the house, and I stood in the south pasture for a while. I thought about what he'd said, that she'd given me the credit I hadn't gotten, that she'd told him the truth about it when she didn't need to, when the easier thing would have been to let me be the help and herself be the one who saved the herd. She hadn't done that. That matters to me now the way it mattered to me then. A person who sees you clearly and tells the truth about what they see, even when they don't have to. Christmas came and went. The new year was cold and clear. On the Garza ranch, things settled into something calmer than they'd been. Raphael was changed, or changing. Garza was aging and leaning on me more in practical ways. The herd was solid and the south pasture recovering, and my records were in order. I found reasons to walk by the corrals in the late afternoon. I'm not proud of this, but I'm not ashamed of it either. I'm 63 years old as I tell you this, and I've been through enough to know that there isn't much point in dressing things up. I was 58, and I found reasons to be where she might be, and I kept my face neutral about it and never said a word to anyone. She knew, I think. She generally knew things. One afternoon in January she was at the near corral fence watching the calves, and I came up beside her on some errand I'd manufactured, and we stood there. The sun was going down behind the ridge and throwing that long winter light across the pasture that makes everything look important, and one of the calves, the November one, the bottle-fed one, came up to the fence and put its nose in her hand. She said, "You should stay." I said, "I'm not going anywhere." She said, "No, I mean you should stay on this ranch. Whatever happens, you should stay." I looked at her. She was looking at the calf. I said, "What's happening?" She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I don't know exactly. But I know that people who know what they're doing should stay in the places where that matters." She paused. "My grandfather stayed too long at a ranch that didn't deserve him, and I used to think that was a waste. Now I think it was just who he was. He stayed because the land mattered and the animals mattered, and you can't leave those things to people who don't understand them, even if the people who do understand them don't get everything they deserve for understanding them." I didn't answer right away. I was looking at her profile, the set of her jaw, the way she was watching the calf with that complete attention she brought to things that earned it. I said, "Are you telling me to stay for the ranch or for something else?" She turned and looked at me, full on the way she did. She said, "Yes." Just that one word. I held her look for a long moment and neither of us said anything, and the calf wandered off and the last light went off the ridge, and I said, "All right." I said it quietly. "All right." That isn't the end of the story, because stories like this don't have clean ends. They just turn into your life. What I can tell you is that Raphael went back to Monterey in March, and this time he didn't come back, which I think they had both known was coming for different reasons. That the ranch, over the following 2 years, became mine to run in a deeper way than it had been, with Garza's health declining and his son's involvement mostly nominal. That Celia stayed, and continued to know more than any given person expected her to know, and gradually stopped managing her face around people who couldn't see what was in front of them. That she and I worked together the way you work with someone who understands what you understand, which is better than any other way I know of working. I'm not going to tell you how it developed or what it became in the end, because that's not yours and it's barely mine to say out loud. I'll tell you that one morning in the spring of the second year, when the south pasture was fully recovered, and the herd was at 260 head, all of them solid, she came out to where I was checking the fence line on the east edge, and she walked the line with me without being asked to. We didn't talk for a long time. The grass was green all the way to the ridge. The cattle were moving slow and right. She stopped at one point and looked out across all of it, and then she looked at me. Not the way she'd looked at the map, or at the pasture, or at the calf. A different look. A look I recognized from a long time ago, from before 8 years of not having it, and it went into me somewhere below speech. She said, "This is a good ranch." I said, "It is." She said, "You made it that." I said, "We made it that." She took my hand. She didn't hold it the way you hold someone's hand to comfort them. She held it the way you hold something that belongs in your hand, something you've decided you're not setting down. Her grip was sure, no hesitation, and we stood there on the east fence line with the spring grass green to the ridge and 260 head grazing right across the bottomland, and the bad years and the silence and the 8 years of being finished in that particular department. All of that was still there, the way things are still there, but I wasn't standing in it alone anymore. I held her hand. We watched the cattle for a long time before we went back to work.